So, as I said earlier, there's this sort of uncomfortable moment where the president of Canadian National Railways says essentially that the francophone population is not capable of working as executives. It creates a lot of unrest in Quebec. There are responses to that at the federal level, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. This is titled Federal Bilingualism, and it is otherwise a very brief overview of something that is often just referred to as the B&B Commission, which is the Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, which was started by Lester B. Pearson in 1963. In that process, what he's aiming to do is addressing unrest in Quebec. Their sort of mandate is to look at bilingualism in the federal government, the role of private organizations in understanding sort of linguistic tensions, how we can sort of talk about having Canadians learn French and English. All of those sorts of things are coming together, and that's the mandate of the B&B Commission. And this is a challenge in some ways, and I imagine many of you have already had that wait a minute moment when we talk about bilingualism and biculturalism as a country, because it affirms a very specific narrative about Canada's history, which is that sort of two founding nations story, right? That the English and the French came together to make Canada. And there's this sort of idea in that about two founding languages, two founding cultures, with a premise of equal partnership. Now, aside from the fact that there are lots of people who don't really think that it was an equal partnership between the French and the English, that's sort of a whole other issue. There's also a pushback from a lot of other people saying, hey, it's more than just you two at this party, right? We're talking about Indigenous groups, certainly, and also every other cultural and linguistic group that has ever sort of contributed to Canada in any meaningful way. And by the 1960s, there's a lot of those. So as far as it goes, the Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission is no longer about biculturalism. By 1965, there was just too much pushback from everyone else, but they're still focused on that sort of bilingualism piece, that sort of English and French tension. Okay, and what this commission finds is essentially that the francophones who were really upset about, hey, there's a problem in Quebec, were right. So this sort of data started to come back that the francophone schools, the francophone hospitals, the francophone universities had worse outcomes for people. The average incomes for unilingual francophones were lower than the average incomes for unilingual anglophones. The English make more money. If I said that wrong, my apologies. When you started looking at the federal public service, francophones who worked in government tended to learn English to be able to communicate with their colleagues, but anglophones working in the federal public service did not tend to do the reverse. So they're not learning French to talk to their colleagues, they're just expecting their colleagues to learn English to talk to them. We also have some sort of data coming out of the Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission about the underrepresentation of francophones in what we would sort of loosely refer to as the corridors of power. So the francophones are underrepresented in government, in management positions, in executive positions, i.e. all of those VPs at CN Rail and none of them is francophone, all of that kind of conversation. So these findings start coming out and it gets to be a little bit awkward, because if you are Quebec and you've been telling the story since 1763 that you're being oppressed in your own country by the Anglophone population, the results coming out of the B&B Commission are basically telling you that you're right. And it makes people sort of angry, and it also, we'll sort of get into some of this, makes a lot of people in Anglophone Canada feel really uncomfortable, because no one really wants to sort of walk into a story and be like, here, I am the oppressor. That's a really uncomfortable position for a lot of people to occupy. They don't like it very much. So there are a number of changes that sort of happen out of this report and out of this sort of commission, this national commission on that. One of them comes out actually before the report is even out, right? Before they're even done, Pearson goes, okay, we need to fix this problem. And one of those changes is one that I think actually all of you will recognize, but maybe don't know has not always been this way, which is that in 1965, Canada's flag changes. So before 1965, there is a flag that has the Union Jack up in the corner. And in 1965, Pearson changes the flag to be the maple leaf that we know today. And one of the reasons for that change, I mean, at that point in time, Canada still is a part, like still has the British monarch as the head of state. All of those sort of connections are still there, but the flag was changed to remove that explicit visual reference to Britain, to sort of recognize this narrative that they're trying to build about two founding nations. Okay? In 1969, you get some conversations about you get the Official Languages Act, which is passed. And what the Official Languages Act in 1969, there's another one in 1988, which changes things a little bit, but in 1969, you have the Official Languages Act, which makes the public service bilingual. And it offers Canadians the right to service from the federal public service in English and in French, and it creates this expectation for federal public servants, i.e. people who work for the federal government, to learn both English and French, and to sort of be able to sort of do that. That is still the case, so if you go to work for the diplomatic corps, your first year of service is learning whatever language you don't speak, unless you already speak both of them fluently, all of that kind of thing. So there's some changes in those expectations. It also sort of creates the current policy of having courses available to teach French to, for example, politicians who don't already speak it, or English if that's the language they don't speak. These changes underlie the Official Languages Act revisions in 1988, and 1988 is the revision to the Official Languages Act that are understood, that make the entire country bilingual, that sort of make French and English the official languages of the entire country, not necessarily just the federal public service. This has some sort of knock-on effects that are pretty massive, in that this kind of commission, this study on bilingualism and biculturalism, and an official government position that Canada was not going to expect absolutely everyone to assimilate, is essentially what underlies Canada's current multiculturalism policies. Because once you've sort of accepted that there are two cultures, talking about 3 or 4 or 5 or 20 is a lot easier in that kind of conversation. It's an attempt in that sort of vein, in that kind of conversation, to manage Quebec's growing nationalism, that sort of increasing feeling at this point in time that Quebec really wants to be its own political entity, at the same time as to manage the sort of growing cultural diversity in the country, see all of the backlash about this originally being a commission on biculturalism. Okay? As is usually the case of any sort of successful document of this type, no one is really happy with it. Okay? No one is really happy with it. In Quebec, this is perceived as sort of too little too late, and because the commission doesn't actually have any solutions for example, the lower quality of hospitals and schools and universities in francophone communities. The commission doesn't have the power to sort of say, oh, right, here's a couple $1 billion to fix that problem. And the other challenge that sort of comes out from nationalists in Quebec is that with the focus in this commission on language and culture, they're missing all of the political issues, all of the political struggles about political representation, about access to power, about the rights to self-determination. All of those things are kind of missing from that discussion because of the focus on language and culture. So there's that sort of piece in Quebec. In the West, especially in the West, this is perceived by Anglophones anyway. We could talk about Francophones in this part of the country too, but by Anglophones in the West as forcing French on an unwilling population. There's a lot of people at this point in time who are like, this is the dumbest thing ever, why is the government worried about it? And in a lot of ways, those Francophones should just get over it. We'll talk about that position for a long time, but just be aware that it exists. There are a number of students in this class who have this background, so they will probably tell this story better than I do. But I will point out that sort of because of that reaction, this means that many of the provisions of the Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission and many of the things that it was supposed to fix don't really reach, meaningfully, Francophones outside of Quebec, right? They don't reach Western Francophones in Alberta, and there are actually a substantial number of them. We have to sort of talk about the sort of some weird pieces of this bilingualism and biculturalism idea, especially when we start talking about things like official languages. So if we're going to talk sheer numbers, okay, there are more people in this country right now whose first language is Mandarin Chinese than whose first language is French. but French is an official language and Chinese is not. And there's no credible bid to make Chinese an official language. And that kind of means that we're relying not just on like numbers, but also on this weird sense of history to sort of talk about what counts as an official language. And once you start doing that, you start getting into a lot of the conversations we've been talking about sort of broadly across the board in terms of, hey, who counts? Because what do we do with indigenous populations, right? How do you talk about, like, yes, there's a lot of people whose first language is Mandarin Chinese, but we could also talk at great length about how Canada's national railways wouldn't exist without the labor of Chinese immigrants. How do you talk about that? So there are definitely some tensions and some perceptions about this report and around bilingualism and biculturalism. As I said, nobody's really happy with it. The nationalists in Quebec are like, that's too little too late and you haven't talked about politics at all. In the West, there's a lot of people going, excuse me, I don't have to learn French if I don't want to, and this is a stupid thing to appease a bunch of whiners. I wish I were kidding about that perception, but I'm not. And then everyone in the country who's not Anglophone or Francophone is sort of sitting here going, hey, what about us? We contributed and we built this country too. So there's a lot of tensions that are still unresolved, but I needed to talk about federal bilingualism. Otherwise, the next stuff we're doing doesn't make sense.